Alpha Squad, a group of 3 fighter jets, would receive satellite confirmation that out of the thousands of people on an island, there were no survivors. But instead of focusing on that, they needed to ensure the issue was contained. The island was on fire as they approached. Now within visual range, they prepared to release. But what they saw was nothing but devastation. No, it was Doomsday. What was once known as Honeymoon Island in the Bahamas was now the smoldering stomping grounds of Superman's most dangerous enemy. The creature wasn't even moving, yet everything around it was burning to death. Now, catching a glimpse of the 3 jets, panic would ensue as they rushed to release their firebombs. But just then, Alpha Squad lost all communications. Their superior officer wanted to know what was going on, and it was reported that all power had just died. But their superior demanded that they be found. Taking a look outside, the pilot watched as the other aircrafts began to critically malfunction. All of their flight systems were down. They'd try their best to correct it, but everything was falling apart as the pilots inside could do nothing but scream for help, wondering if anyone could hear them. And thankfully, Superman did, managing to save all 3 from certain doom. From there, Superman delivered the squad about 20 miles away on the USS Garrison. As he called for medical aid, Superman couldn't help but think that of all the thousands who died on the island, he was only able to save 3. Superman would then tell the admiral aboard that he needed to turn around immediately, but the man was unwilling. Superman would explain that the jets fell apart mid-flight. It was as if just being near the creature was enough to suck away all the energy from both the jets and bombs. Superman was unwilling to have any more people put in harm's way. To this, the Admiral was more interested in being told about the kill zone's radius, but was interrupted by one of the medics who believed he needed to see something. Now exposed, the pilot's face was horrifically warped. Without hesitation, Superman flew into action, again thinking of his own failure. Looking upon the scorched landmass, Superman further specified with a scowl on his face that 3,220 people had been killed, and he was here to find their killer. He could see and hear more than almost anyone on the planet. But now, all those senses showed him were all the people he couldn't save. Now in his fortress of solitude, Superman met with perhaps the greatest scientific mind on Earth, Dr. Shea Veritas. She'd risked her life to join him there, but that wasn't what was making her fearful. Her voice cracked as she confirmed the culprit to be Doomsday. With this, Superman knew they were in serious trouble. Last time, Doomsday emerged from a rift in the Phantom Zone, so Superman wondered if maybe it was using the zone again to teleport around the world, questioning if there was a way to predict where he'd show up next. But according to the Doctor, it wouldn't make a difference, which Superman would point out to be a bit cynical, but Shea would explain herself with a visual aid. This was the version of Doomsday Superman was used to facing. Crazy physicality that was enough to kill Superman, but that's about it. But this new version of Doomsday, when he emerged from the ocean, the water boiled around him. When stepped on the sand, it turned to black onyx. Anyone within 100 yards of the thing spontaneously combusted. Even the brick and stone of the island's buildings couldn't maintain their molecular structure around him, simply falling apart. Honestly, what Superman faced before was just the monster's larva stage. It's only now that the creature has reached maturity. Getting to the point, Superman took her words to mean that he couldn't beat it. But Shea would correct him, saying that Superman was the only being on the planet who could survive more than 10 minutes against it in direct combat. Superman's face was dark. We keep saying it. Is it sentient? Shea wondered what Superman was asking her. Superman turned to her. Can I kill it? Shea wasn't sure if he could, but hoped that he would. That may not have been what he meant, but Shay was well aware of that. Speaking candidly, she'd point out that Superman already knew what he was going to do, and with that, there wasn't any time to think of anything else. Doomsday killed thousands of people in a matter of minutes. Superman wasn't going to give it the opportunity to kill billions. Superman was speechless as Shay continued. She knew that Superman was just wondering what would happen to him if he succeeds, that if he takes that step, if he kills, what will he become? Shay made herself clear here. Until Doomsday is dead, Superman couldn't afford to worry about anything or anyone else. Shifting to Clark Kent's hometown of Smallville, a woman on a motorcycle would be told to halt by a military officer. He'd explain to the woman that the entire area was being quarantined. This woman was Lana Lang, one of Clark's childhood friends, and she'd let the guard know that her family was there. He'd apologize, but he had his orders. Nobody was allowed in or out. Although he would tell her that the Red Cross had a holding area for relatives at a nearby hotel. Unsatisfied, Lana made her way back towards the bike, telling the guard that she actually had a pass. The guard hadn't heard anything about a pass, but Lana assured him that she was an electrical engineer, claiming that the military contracted her to work with rescue and research. As she grabbed hold of her shotgun, Lana doubted that Clark would approve, but was willing to bear with it since he wasn't actually around at the moment. But just as she prepared herself, a honking truck would arrive, demanding that they open up on account of an important person coming through. It was Lois Lane, and the guard was quick to let her in, clearly smitten. And once there was enough distance between them, Lois would tell the stranger holding onto the side of her car to get in. The two would introduce themselves to one another, clearly unaware of their mutual connection. Lana wondered how Lois managed to convince the guard, and Lois just joked about having Jedi mind tricks. Recognizing her name, Lana realized that Lois works for the Daily Planet, so she'd ask where Clark was. Lois would just point out the fact that he wasn't here, which wasn't a very good look for his hometown pride or reporting skills. Lois would ask if the two were friends, and Lana would confirm that the two grew up together. And just like that, Lois had a lead. Crazy family girl breaks quarantine was a good one. Lois would tell Lana to suit up. They were going to find out what they weren't being told about Smallville. Over on the roof of the Daily Planet, Clark Kent would call out to someone, calling them Chief. The man would respond by reminding Clark that he wasn't his boss anymore. But that aside, he wondered what Clark was doing here at all, expecting him to be in Smallville since that's where Lois was. But Clark wasn't looking for Lois, he was looking to talk to this guy, Mr. White. Mr. White was pretty sure Clark quit, so he suddenly felt the need to talk to the people downstairs for letting just anyone go to the roof of the building. Clark would confirm that he had in fact quit, but Mr. White gave the best advice in town, so he was hoping to get a bit more for old time's sake. Mr. White could tell that Clark was targeting his paternal instincts, but didn't mind and was willing to hear him out. Clark would explain, "I've got a story. Sort of an old story, one I thought was over. I can dig into it again. I think I have to, but people could get hurt. If I do that, what does that make me? Who will I be if I make those choices? Should I even care about that?" Clark's words were a bit vague here, but Mr. White got the gist. Although uncommon, this sort of thing comes up in the business from time to time. He'd say that you need solid principles to be a good journalist, but had to admit that sometimes those same principles needed to be compromised to get the job done. Life wasn't always about rules. As nice as it would be, things can't always be rock solid. With this sort of work, you really had to just follow your gut and take leaps of faith. It was impossible for Clark to know who he'd be on the other side, but the fact that he was asking for advice before doing so at all, even from an old guy like him, was one hell of a good sign. "You were a good kid when I met you, Clark, and you're a good man now. You'll do okay." Shaking hands, Clark would thank his former boss, who'd tell him to go out there and get that damn story, but wanted the next time they spoke to be about getting him back to the Daily Planet. "You got it, Chief." Chief. Over in Smallville, things are looking grim as about 539 people suddenly fell into comas at the same time. Lois tries to comfort Lana, offering to find some answers. Just then, Lana saw her parents and couldn't restrain herself despite the confusion of the doctors. Lois would then identify herself before asking if they'd figured out the cause yet. The doctor wasn't sure if he was supposed to be talking or not, which Lois took as a no. The doctor would confirm that Lois's dad was a senator. He was pretty sure her dad was still on site and would offer to call him, but Lois wasn't interested. Instead, she wanted to see what was going on inside, which the doctor would reluctantly agree to. Once inside, Lana would message Clark, telling him she was in Smallville and how bad it was, that her parents had been hit by whatever this was too. Meanwhile, Lois's eyes were glowing, which wasn't normal, as she quietly said that all bodies were accounted for and all their brains were functioning. Lana would continue by saying that everyone who stuck around after they left got hit by it too. She was sure Clark must be busy, but as she held her mother's hand, she wondered where Clark was. Responding to her texts, Clark would apologize profusely. He'd tell her that she needed to hold down the fort while he was gone, but promised to come back. Meanwhile, Lois was still glowing, now claiming to be commencing a neural bore, telling someone to prepare for an uplink. Having a bit of a mental conversation with an unseen person, she'd laugh before saying, "No, they have no idea." Over in Botswana, a herd of wildebeest was crossing gator-infested waters. A film crew was passing by and filming the whole thing. Apparently, millions of animals were all migrating thousands of miles. It was the greatest shifting of biomass the planet had ever seen, and countless would die, but there was something else happening out there. It was a horrific scene of devastation that could hardly be considered natural at all. Over in Zambia, John Irons was visiting his niece Natasha after testing his steel armor with a long flight. But to interrupt their casual conversation would be signs of devastation. Telling Natasha to get in her truck and take the first flight out, John rushed into action. She worried about his safety, but he'd tell her they call him Steel, assuring her that he'd be fine. Quickly coming face to face with Doomsday, Steel demanded that the monster stop where it stood. But when Doomsday wouldn't listen, Steel charged in, only to be warned about airborne toxins from his suit. But it was already too late for that. Steel swung his weapon at the Goliath, only for it to shatter over its head instantly. Undaunted, the creature continued to expel its deadly fumes. Not long after that, Steel had been cast to the side and was unable to fight. At that moment, Wonder Woman entered the fray, wondering how she could help. Steel assured the hero that he'd be alright thanks to his suit's life support systems, but he would tell her to stay away from the monster, proposing that she wait until they could all hit it at once. But Wonder Woman wasn't interested in waiting. This wasn't her first time facing Doomsday, and she felt the need to settle the score. Brandishing her sword, Wonder Woman greeted the beast, recognizing how much bigger it was now, but remaining undeterred. As the two prepared for one another, she asked if it remembered her, and once she plunged her sword into its abdomen, she'd make it clear that she remembered Doomsday all too well. But despite the heavy blow, Wonder Woman began to wobble before being forced to take a knee. Somehow, she was the one in more pain thanks to that exchange. And looking at her hand, she now knew why. Poison. But instead of backing down, Diana simply accepted her fate. Doomsday lunged forward, prepared to tear her limb from limb, but was interrupted by a sudden laser beam. It was Superman, who'd immediately tell Wonder Woman she needed to leave. But again, Diana refused to budge until the creature that was killing the world was dead. Insisting that she was fine, she'd tell him to worry about it and not her. Eyes glowing, Superman 2 would notice how much bigger Doomsday was now. He'd also ask how many it's killed, to which Wonder Woman would say too much before urging the Man of Steel to act now before it collected itself. Agreeing, the heroes, including the downed Steel, were prepared to attack with everything they had all at once. Wonder Woman's battle cry was enough to split the heavens, and much to their surprise, Doomsday actually stopped. Superman knew now that it was his turn to cut loose like he'd never done before. He needed to finish this no matter what. But before he could, a portal would appear, and before Superman could catch him, Doomsday slipped through it. And just like that, it was gone. But not really. Doomsday wanted Earth. It wasn't going anywhere until there was nothing left. Meeting up inside an emergency Justice League bunker, Superman and Wonder Woman were now joined by their comrades as Cyborg let it be known that Doomsday managed to kill more than 1 million animals in less than 20 minutes just by walking past them. In fact, wildebeest were now on the brink of extinction. And according to Aquaman, they had a dead zone in the Antarctic that was 300 miles wide and only getting bigger. Green Lantern was off-world and projected over hologram. Unfortunately, the Green Lanterns were dealing with a battle on 2 fronts, although he would offer to contact another Green Lantern, or even the Red Lanterns, if they didn't think those guys would just make matters worse. Superman was stern with the group, telling them that wherever Doomsday appears next, none of them were to go anywhere near it. Their job was to save as many people as they can and help the places it's already been. As to suddenly interrupt and refuse this was Lex Luthor in hologram form. According to Lex, their job was to die. Superman demanded to know what Luthor wanted, questioning if things weren't already bad enough. Despite their grievances, Lex expressed that he was here to help, adding that no one there would be able to survive a fight with Doomsday. Superman would begin to speak about being the only one to face it, but Lex would ask the Kryptonian to at least hear him out first. Based on his findings, Doomsday wasn't killing life, he was draining it to feed himself, and as a result was growing bigger and stronger with each appearance. But ultimately, everything they'd seen it eat was just an appetizer. It was like a shark, only ever moving forward and simply eating whatever small fry it came across. This was all with a bigger prize in mind, an ultimate meal, which darkly, Superman knew to be him. Superman represented the most concentrated source of raw power on Earth, or maybe even the galaxy. Doomsday came here for him. Batman points to this as mere speculation. After all, if it really wanted Superman, why did it run every time he'd show up? Lex's answer was simple. The monster wasn't ready. But as it continues to consume the energy of lesser life forms, eventually it would be. Turning to Superman, Lex would tell Superman that he should just leave. Looking down, Superman would call out to Diana, who wasn't having it, insulted by the notion alone. But Lex stuck to his guns, telling Superman to fly away from the planet. That way, maybe Doomsday would leave too. But the Flash wasn't really sold on just a maybe, but yelling back. Luthor was certain that it was by far their best option. He was even willing to show them the math, although he doubted their ability to properly interpret it. Now, Wonder Woman was really annoyed, but before she could let her frustrations be known, Superman would stop them all, saying that Lex was right. He was prepared to leave, but planned on taking Doomsday with him. As far as he was concerned, nothing had changed. All of them were to help put the world back together, while he made sure there was a world left for them to save at all. As for once, Superman and Lex Luthor were on the same page, despite the disapproval of the League. Following behind him, Batman would tell Superman that he was letting Lex get to him, which Superman denied. Batman wasn't so sure this was all Superman's fault, despite what he was probably thinking. Earth had plenty of superpowered entities. Doomsday could have come for any of them. Superman wouldn't even try to deny the possibility. Batman would continue, but Superman interrupted to say that none of that mattered now. He wasn't trying to be the big hero or anything. It was just the way things were. No one else stood a chance against the thing. Now turning to Batman, Superman handed him something in case he didn't make it back. Batman was then stunned to learn that it was the key to Superman's Fortress of Solitude. As with a smile, Superman would tell his old friend not to get too excited since Wonder Woman had one too. As right on cue, she appeared to speak with him. Before she could say anything, he'd tell her that he had to go. Punching his unyielding shoulder, she'd admit that she knew it to be true. She'd tell him to just go. And as he held her aloft in the air, she'd tell him to go kill the thing and bring her its head. Holding each other tightly, Superman claimed that to be the most romantic thing she'd ever said to him. Superman had spent hours orbiting Earth at 1,000 miles per second. With this, he'd be able to find Doomsday wherever he reappeared in less than a minute. But that wasn't nearly fast enough. The scene then shifted to India. Crying out in horror, a family was on the verge of being wiped out when Doomsday's toxins took to the air. But just in the nick of time, Superman appeared, clapping to disperse the airborne death. For a 50th of a second, he hesitated as he looked into the creature's eyes, searching for something, anything to tell him that Doomsday was deserving of life. But then, he heard the boy crying behind him, now promising to keep them safe instead. Doomsday leapt into the air, prepared to crush him, but Superman immediately countered with a titanic fist of his own, hurling the creature into the air before flying up to reach him. Despite his fear, the boy could only be amazed by what he saw. Superman then grabbed hold of Doomsday and flew the creature off-world. As its jagged fists tore into his face, Superman remembered his promise as he pushed his flights to levels never before seen. As the two struggled to overpower one another, Superman considered the deaths of everyone he cared for at the hands of Doomsday. Crying out in refusal of such a possibility, Superman released his heat vision at point-blank range. He gave it everything he had, absolutely unloading on the creature until there was nothing left of it but a fiery pile of flesh. After that, Superman made good on his promise to Lana by returning to Smallville. Everyone was shocked to see the Man of Steel suddenly appear and do so in such a horrible state. Clearly sick, Superman apologized for being late, but now, getting back on his feet, was ready to see if there was anything he could do for the people of Smallville. But that's when he knew it wasn't really over. Just then, a portal appeared behind him, and when he turned, smoldering and enraged, it was Doomsday yet again. After being punched a great distance away, Superman would cry out for them all to run far, far away. Doomsday then got up close and personal with his prey, grabbing hold of his face before lifting and slamming the hero into the ground again and again with tremendous force. Once he was down, Doomsday proceeded to beat him with repeated fists. After a bit of this, Superman mustered the full extent of his remaining strength to resist. As with all his might, Superman literally pulled Doomsday apart. Then he cast the two halves aside before beginning to truly succumb to the toxins. And as death encroached upon him, Superman's final words were of the many promises he'd made. This was now the beginning of the end. Superman is dying. If you enjoyed this video, then you won't want to miss the alternate timeline where Batman became Doomsday and killed Superman himself.